Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this week's episode, we continue our look at the story of the home front in the Great War, with a focus on the vital role women played in supporting the war effort and how that crucial time period changed the world we live in today. Well, hello Dan, it's the second of our set of episodes that we're studying the home front in that we're about to record today. And the topic that we're tackling today, really we could have made an entire set of episodes within this set, because the topic of women at war and women within the First World War is one that is almost equal in importance to what you might call men in the war, because we're apt to forget, I think, with our focus on actually the fighting armies and of the action at the front line, that approximately half the world's population are, of course, women. And in the First World War, half the combatant nation's population were women. And indeed, it was the support of women on the home front when menfolk were away, when the demographics had changed, that played a huge role in the ability of the nations to actually sustain the war.
Yeah, hi Spence. Very well-made points there. I don't think it's going to shock too many people that 50% of the world's population are women, but worth remembering when we tell this story. And it is, of course, going to be an important story. I should admit, I'm going to be the first to admit, it's not one of my stronger suits. So I'm going to be as much learning as much out of this as you're going to be teaching, I'm sure. So it is, though, a fascinating story and one that I think we all too often overlook. So great to be able to shine a light on that today. And, you know, as you mentioned, right at the start there, you know, it is going to be one that's predominantly home front focused. But of course, the story of women on the Western Front is a very real one as well. No doubt we'll segue into that as we go through. But I mean, to start us off, Spence, I guess the kind of key point here is to draw a bit of a picture of what Britain looks like in the months and years leading up to the outbreak of war, because it really helps us inform the story when it comes to understanding just how it changed from 1914 to 1918 as far as women are concerned.
It's a great point, and it relates, of course, to ideas that we've discussed relating to the soldiers of the First World War, that life, and we're going to talk predominantly about Britain, but it applies, in fact, to all combatant nations, or all Western combatant nations, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States to an extent. And that's that, of course, in the pre-war world, gender roles were rather different to how they are in the 21st century. Gender roles were very strictly defined. Women generally, although not exclusively, but generally cast as homemakers and mothers. And although that didn't mean that women were barred from work, they were barred from some forms of work. Some forms of work were very much considered a male-dominated trade. Now, in some cases, there were practical reasons for that, such as extremely heavy labour, which it wasn't felt women would be fit for. In other cases, there was a certain amount of snobbery, such as definitely looking down on women who wanted to become doctors, for example. And indeed, women doctors in the First World War would actually prove just how effective they could be. If we just focus on Britain for a moment, I think there's a common idea that women didn't work in pre-war Britain. And that might be true for the educated classes, or the highly educated middle classes and the upper classes, where if you were in that social strata, to be seen to be working was actually a little bit unfashionable. Women simply didn't work. It wasn't what was done. What an upper class and a middle class woman, for the most part, and we're painting broad brushstrokes here, would do, was they would engage in salon activities, then they would ultimately find a husband and be involved in family life. But below the middle class, women had always worked in Britain. And this, in fact, was true across most of the Western world at this time. And life for a working woman was pretty tough. The jobs for men were pretty tough. The jobs for women were a lot more limited in the pre-war period. They'd often involve selling things, for example, tobacco or homemaking equipment. They'd often involve textile work, whether that was manufacturing textiles or even cleaning textiles. Laundry work was a very popular industry in some of the biggest cities in Britain and indeed elsewhere in Europe and the United States. And what united pre-war women's work was two things, really. It was monotonous and it was poorly paid. No matter how you actually monitor women's pay prior to the First World War, it was always substantially below that of men. But Certainly in Britain, working class women often had to work because the wages that their family would be bringing in. And it's important particularly to think of this in terms of family groups would live together longer in the pre-war period. Your children would not necessarily move out until they were quite well into adulthood. We often think of this as a modern phenomenon. It is absolutely not. This is very much the case in pre-war Britain, where you often wanted to keep some sons at home, even when they were grown adults, because they would bring in wages. And for families that were poor, as most British families were, having the women of the family bring in some money was a crucial supplement to what were the men folk were bringing in as well. It was very much a team effort in the families. But to emphasize that point that I made before, we've made about soldiers, life was extremely boring. There was no prospect of social advancement. There was little prospect of improving your job. And although there was therefore a large workforce, it was not engaged for the most part in what we now call skilled labour. And the prospects of ever really getting out of this situation were pretty minimal. If life was hard for the men at home, it was equally, or perhaps even more so, hard for the women, because as well as this work, they'd also, of course, have to be raising their families in many cases at a time when infant mortality was extremely high. So this was it was a tough life to be a working class woman in anywhere in the West in this period, Dan. And I'm not entirely sure we really appreciate just how challenging that could be in the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the numbers, and you mentioned infant mortality there, and I know it's something we've mentioned before. It's in some cases as high as 1 in 5, so 20% infant mortality. At the turn of the last century, that's almost unthinkable when you look at just how far things have come today. And in a sense, I think the story of women's lives has come almost as far as that. It really is incredible. But, you made a good point there, Spence, actually. When we look at the story of women in the Great War, I think perhaps one of the things that's easy to do, and I say this as somebody that doesn't know the subject particularly well, you can look at it and say, well, no women worked in 1914. Everyone worked in 1918. And of course, the truth is very different to that. In fact, by 1914, 27% of women of working age are in fact in work. As you said, Spence, there are a couple of kind of key areas where you find women in work. One of them is domestic service. That's pretty common, particularly in the big cities where the second oldest daughter will go out. And of course, one of the key things there is you get some lodging as well, and you get your meals paid for. So you at least staying away from the true poverty that exists in some parts of the workforce. And the other thing is textiles. And this has been going on since the Victorian period, but women working in textile factories is certainly something that's very common and has been done for quite a while. Now, the shift, though, which is really interesting, and not necessarily instantaneous, but we do see those fairly big strides fairly quickly, comes along, of course, with the declaration of war in 1914. And Spence, it really throws a cat amongst the pigeon in Britain's workforce in general, of course, because, all of a sudden you've got a massive load of manpower who's previously been involved in the civilian sector who are quite simply not there anymore.
It's interesting to reflect that it's not a uniquely British problem. It actually affects Britain and the wider empire as well. But in the English-speaking world, the problem is a little bit different to that's experienced in France and Germany. France and Germany, with much, much larger armies, have got a more detailed and a more considered approach to how they're going to mobilize their army. And they're aware that by mobilizing millions of soldiers with their conscript forces at the outbreak of war, that's going to put a lot of strain, actually, on the home front. And the French and the Germans, although they don't necessarily mobilize women in the same way, there is something of an expectation that either some men will stay behind or some women will actually take over certain roles. We can perhaps talk about that more later in the episode. But in Britain has no plans for mass mobilization whatsoever. It is going to mobilize its existing army, its territorial forces, call upon resources from around the empire, and really work it out as it goes along. And it's only Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War's call for volunteers in August 1914 that changes everything. And of course, it produces this mass volunteerism period, which completely reshapes the British economic scene, because millions of men will leave their jobs, quite often well-paying jobs, quite often highly skilled jobs, and pour into the armed forces. And nothing has been done to actually prepare Britain for this whatsoever. And it's mirrored, I should add, in the white parts of the empire, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, where, of course, men pour into the services, and it leaves gaps all over the home front. And for women, the reactions to the outbreak of war really are as varied as those of the men. But one thing that I think does come through quite strongly, as well as fear, particularly if you have a loved one in the army, you're going to worry about their safety. There's also excitement amongst the women of Europe and particularly of Britain, because there's a real sense that this is a change. And a quote which, given what happens to her later in the war, is quite bitter when we look back on it, that I think captures something about this is from Vera Brittain, who herself will be a nurse in the war. Her war is a personal disaster. She loses every single man she loves in the war. She never really recovers from it, and she becomes a vehement anti-war writer after the war. But writing in her own diary in August 1914, she, as a very middle-class woman, really an upper-middle-class woman, is incredibly excited about this. And she actually wrote in her diary, on the eve of the war, "Today has been far too exciting to enable me to feel at all like sleep. In fact, it is one of the most thrilling I have ever lived through. That which has been so long anticipated by some and scoffed at by others has come to pass. Armageddon in Europe." And given what happens to Vera Brittain, you might reflect on this and say this was, terribly naive, given that she would lose so many loved ones. But I think it captures something that, whereas the men who we've commented before often had very boring jobs, now they've got an opportunity to have an adventure. For millions of women too, this war represented an opportunity and an adventure, a change from what had basically been decades of the same old work. And nobody quite knew how it was going to play out. Nobody quite knew what was going to happen. And it was as an exciting a period for women, especially young women, especially if you didn't have a connection to someone in the forces, as it was for the men who were going off on the adventure. And it opened up a vast vista, really, of new roles and new jobs, because ultimately, Dan, somebody's got to do the jobs that all the men were doing before they volunteered for service.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's quite a simple equation when you look at it by that sense. It's interesting when you say, when we look at the story of men in 1914, many of those guys that were in those jobs would have found them themselves quite monotonous. It's quite interesting that when those same jobs open up to women, all of a sudden there's great excitement about it. There's that kind of novelty. And you can just imagine, there's a good point to make here, I think, in that generally excitement is the order of the day in August 1914 across all stratas of British society. And in fact, across much of Europe. What Vera Brittain said there in that very interesting quote, I suspect probably echoes far more voices than today we give credit for. So, the opportunities are all of a sudden of doing something completely new. And importantly, and this is one I'm sure we'll come back to, having some disposable income as an individual, particularly for women for the first time, really, really is a big deal. But, let's have a look at some of those options that all of a sudden open up for women, because there are quite a few, and some of them perhaps we know of very well. Other ones are a little more surprising. I mean, let's start off with a one for you here, Spence. I mean, something like police, for example, women being able to be in uniform, literally police the countries, albeit with certain restrictions. That's something that's never been done before. And this is going to mark a significant change in the way that Britain's society operates.
It is. And it seems difficult to grasp now because, of course, we're a century on. But the idea of putting women in what we would call positions of authority beyond perhaps the schoolroom, where women teachers were widely accepted, is quite a revolutionary idea in 1914. The idea that women can be bus ticket inspectors, uniformed, postal workers, uniformed, and above all else, police officers, and carry out arrests if necessary, and carry out police work, is really quite remarkable. It's something that just isn't really considered at all before the First World War. Yes, there are those who are agitating for this social change, but they've not made a great deal of progress before 1914. And then 1914 comes along. Of course, men are leaving en masse for the services. Well, somebody's got to do this job. And the police is an interesting example because pressure to actually bring in women police officers, it's quite a clever campaign. One, clearly there is a need for women to take some of these policing roles, but also it's spun on the grounds that now the population has become a little bit unbalanced on the home front. There's going to be more women at home than there are men. Men working, particularly fighting age men at the front. So it's appropriate to have women police officers because they may be arresting women. And it seems so sort of odd and almost quaint, perhaps. But it's these kind of considerations that are meeting. You're meeting a certain degree of social conservatism and you're meeting a pressing need to actually have women do different jobs and do jobs that had previously been the domain of the menfolk. And it doesn't go without criticism, it has to be said. Even in the midst of the war, there's some criticism of this type of activity. And perhaps the strongest criticism for bringing women into what had previously been a male-dominated trade is not actually policing, it's not the postal service, it's actually working on the railways. The railways in Britain are absolutely pivotal to the British economy in the First World War, and it's traditionally been a very heavily male-dominated industry. It's very heavily unionised. It's considered quite a tough job. You're shoveling a lot of coal, you're wielding a lot of heavy machinery. It's a well-paid job in relative terms, certainly compared to other jobs. And the railway unions have defended their position extremely strongly prior to the First World War and have really resisted any what they call dilution, the idea of either letting in unskilled workers or letting in women. And this, of course, poses the government with a problem because you absolutely need the railways to fight the war. It's as simple as that. They move all of Britain's supplies, they move Britain's soldiers, they move Britain's population. You absolutely must have efficient railways. How can you do it when so many railway men are at work and the railway unions are against the idea of dilution? Well, ultimately, you have to make it happen because otherwise your railways grind to a halt. And the expansion of women working in railways is absolutely massive, Dan.
It is. I mean, rises from 9,000 in 1914 right up to 50,000 by the end of the war. So that's no small amount. And when you consider that there are battalions raised to fight on the Western Front, they're exclusively made of railwaymen. It's no great surprise. There is a big void to fill there. And in fact, women are going to come in and do that job, albeit, and this is a point that we can make throughout this episode, Spence, not for the same amount of money.
No, they're not. And this is where this issue of dilution is really important. Labour relations in Britain, and indeed in the wider Western world before the First World War, are absolutely clear about the differentiation between a skilled worker, a semi-skilled worker, and an unskilled worker. And unfortunately, within that very, very broad set of categories, women almost always get classified as unskilled workers. And that's largely just due to prejudice, everyday sexism, the idea that women can't possibly work as hard as men, they can't possibly be as good at this job as men, and therefore they are classed as unskilled labour in this hierarchy of labour. And one thing, I mentioned this idea of dilution, which is everywhere. It's a great concern in Britain prior to the war, and it's a huge concern in the war. The idea that if you allow in unskilled people, whether they are men, whether they are women, whether they are recent immigrants, you're going to lower the wages of the existing or working staff. And this mass appearance of women in work is actually an absolutely the biggest threat to what the unions have been fighting to preserve before the First World War that there's ever been. Suddenly you have thousands of women who, by the union standards, are unskilled, therefore they should be paid less. Well, that's dilution. And that will, as the unions correctly perceive, once it's proved that women can actually do the same job as a man for a lot less money, the long-term prospects are actually quite dangerous for you as a skilled worker. And so the unions across industries where there is unionisation are probably the biggest barrier actually to allowing women in the workplace. And the railways are absolutely no exception to that. And this is where I think the war as a catalyst for change is really, really important. There's a huge debate about to what extent did the war, in inverted commas, benefit women. And the current academic mood is it didn't really benefit women a great deal. After the war, most countries went back to how it was before 1914. But I think psychologically, the war was a huge turning point because it did prove that women could actually do these jobs and do these jobs as well as the men in a number of cases. And if railways were a big one, perhaps the biggest change was actually war industry and indeed industry in general. And here, of course, we're using a very broad brushstroke. This could be linen manufacture, it could be textile manufacture, it could be heavy industry. But really, I think the biggest success story, at least as far as women's employment in Britain goes, is the incredible move of women going into armaments factories that are under the umbrella of the Ministry of Munitions, Dan, because this quickly becomes the single biggest employer of women in the entire British Empire.
Yeah, it's a big story, and it's probably the story. When you think about women at war, I think almost immediately that the word munitionettes is going to spring to mind. And this is true whether it's in the UK, in the US particularly, who are an enormous, enormous manufacturer of war munitions and various shells and bullets and all kinds of things related to keeping the fight sustained. And of course, that job needs to be filled. But what's really interesting about this, Spence, as well, is also the munitions industry itself needs to expand at a really rapid rate in 1914, 15 and 16. It's really too small to sustain these enormous armies that Britain, for one, has just never seen before. All told, men serving in a British Empire uniform in the First World War, 7.8 million. That is a huge amount of logistic support required. And of course, with that many men away, it's going to be the women who pick up the slack. Particularly, and of course, the story of shells we've covered in quite a lot of detail before now, when really in 1915, they're just not up to scratch. We need to see a massive expansion, but also an increase in quality. And as a result, in the Great War, we're going to see 700,000 women pour into manufacturing, into industry, into armaments work. It's going to be a massive, enormous change. And it's got to be said, a dangerous one too.
It has. And before I come on to the dangers of women's war work, I really want to emphasize this point for our listeners, that this pouring of women into the factories, the what we might call the war economy factories, is mirrored not just in Britain, but it's mirrored in Canada, it's mirrored in Australia, it's mirrored even to an extent in New Zealand with a smaller military economy. It's mirrored in America, where about 1 million women enter war work in some form or another in effectively 18 months from the American declaration of war in April 17 to the end of the war in November 1918. Wherever the war is being fought, certainly in the British Empire and the English-speaking world, this is taking place. France and Germany are a little bit different, and perhaps we can come on to those countries in a little moment, although it is also taking place there. And this represents, therefore, a huge cultural shift. This is something that just hasn't happened before in history and wasn't really conceived of before in history. And suddenly you're bringing women in, and they gradually, of course, become involved in more and more and more work, including, we've mentioned, munitionettes, women who are actually working on shells or bullets or equipment. But their opportunities to work in armaments factories grow, in fact, as the war goes on, and more men are drawn to the Western Front. It's almost a sort of push-pull. The more men who are involved in the war effort in the West, the more women you need at home to actually keep them supplied. The bigger the armies get, the more the factories have to produce. And so it results in this constant spiral of women's employment in various military factories. But as you say, Dan, this is by no means easy or indeed entirely safe work. There's a host of dangers that you can face working in armaments. So, of course, Dan, there's an absolute host of dangers that you can actually face working in an armaments factory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a really huge range as well, because it goes from everything from the classic industrial accident, which of course can happen to anybody at any time when you're working with heavy machinery, particularly if you're learning your trade on the job and you're working longer hours, both of which are really important factors when it comes to women in the factories. Because of course, we have to remember the stakes are super high. Production needs to be at its absolute maximum, operating as efficiently as possible all of the time. When you're working long hours in difficult conditions, perhaps with a new job, the possibility for an accident and even a fatal one is really very, very high. And then, of course, you need to look at things like the substances you're working with. There are, of course, dangers working with textiles and in textile factories and making uniforms and things like that. But now if you start to add things like explosives into the mix, the risk goes right up. And we see this in a number of different ways. One is quite simply explosions. And we do see in a number of high-profile incidents, 2 really big explosions I'm thinking of in the Great War. One in January 1917 at Silvertown on the east side of London, and a second one up in Nottinghamshire known as the Chilwell explosion. Kills 134 people and about 50 tons of TNT explodes. About 25 of those are women workers who were killed in that incident. So these kind of big events we know of and we've heard of, and they certainly happen, and hundreds of women will lose their lives in explosions and workplace accidents throughout the Great War. But also there's a toxic element as well. And I know, Spence, we've covered some of this kind of toxic issues when we looked at our medical situation before, but toxic jaundice, the famous canary girls, is a really big deal in the Great War. And it's even if it doesn't kill you, it certainly is not a pleasant experience.
It's really not. And this is caused by TNT. And TNT, if you have repeated exposure to it, it has a number of negative effects on your body, but also in its most serious form, it will begin to attack your liver. And what that will do is it will give you jaundice. You'll get anemia and you'll get jaundice untreated. If you continue working at this, you'll die. It will kill you. And though that's the deadly version of it, there's also this staining of the skin. And the girls with yellow hands is actually there's a song written about the girls with yellow hands, a Homefront song at the time. They're also known as the Canary Girls, of course, that these women are being turned yellow by working with all these chemicals. And this is something that was not really understood prior to the war, because there just hadn't been TNT manufacturing on that scale. And of course, this is an era when medical treatment at home, medical treatment is still in its infancy in many respects. And so one of the things that makes it more complicated is the women are getting stained hands just from working. So they have these yellow hands. It's very difficult to wash off. It's got all kinds of problems. And if that then becomes liver failure and it becomes jaundice, you might not notice it until it's much too late. And it might prove fatal. And even if it doesn't prove fatal, you're going to need quite a lot of time to recover from this. And this is a time when you're not given sick pay. If you don't work, you don't get paid. And so women push themselves through, but this can create all kinds of long-term problems, not least with pregnancies. It's well attested in the war that munitionettes who fall pregnant and give birth, their babies are invariably born with jaundice. And nowadays, that is a health and safety disaster. The idea of a pregnant woman working very closely with lots and lots of chemicals until very, very late in her term. Absolutely ghastly. But of course, in the war, that's just not understood in the same way, the same way it is now. And we mentioned explosions as well. If you consider how you actually build a shell, which is quite simple, in the simplest terms, you have the shell casing, you fill it with powder, you put your detonator in the top. That's careful, neat work. And then you have to tap that down. Now, you have to be really careful with this. The detonators aren't, in theory, primed, but if you tap too hard, when you just mishit it, you might set that shell off, or you might, and that's going to be absolutely fatal to you, even if it's a small shell. You're going to mutilate yourself. You're likely going to kill yourself as well. And this is happening every day. There are thousands of shells will pass through your hands if you're a woman worker and you're working for several years. There's fatal blasts, as you've already mentioned. Chilwell in Nottinghamshire is probably the most famous. But there's others as well, smaller ones, which don't destroy the entire factory, but certainly injure some of the munitionettes. It is dangerous, grueling work, and the dangers increase the longer you do it. You're more likely to get TNT poisoning. You're more likely to have an accident that's going to injure you. Even losing a finger or losing an eye is a real danger if something just flies at you. This is dangerous, difficult, challenging work. And one thing I would say is it's overwhelmingly done by working class women. This is very much an opportunity for them as much as we've painted as its dangers, because despite these dangers, despite the threats that you're going to encounter, crucially, you can earn a lot more money as a munitionette than you could have done in the standard working routes for a woman worker before the war, whether that's domestic service, whether it's cleaning and laundretting, whether it's doing textile work. Whatever you're doing, you're going to earn more in a factory. But I think they earn their money, Dan.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And I was just thinking as you were describing that situation there, of course, that when we go back to the idea of policing as well, and policing things like munitions factories, one of the key roles that's taken by women police officers in this situation is to make sure that women are not bringing anything dangerous into the workplace, because you quite simply cannot have any metal anywhere on your body. So people are quite simply searched. No matches, of course, no naked lights, no cigarettes, anything that could cause a spark is completely off limits. And so these are incredibly dangerous positions to be in. And, you make a good point, Spence, when you're talking about, how this is, though, an opportunity. Massive numbers of female munitionettes, some estimates say up to 90% by the end of the war. It's a really female-dominated environment. But it's also worth mentioning here that there's also the element of motivation here. because much like the men who are away in the fighting front, who want to, in inverted commas, do their bit, this is a real important thing for women. It's a real opportunity to do their bit for their male loved ones that are away in the fighting front. So as well as there being the motivation in terms of earning money and getting new pay and potentially even social advancement, becoming a forewoman at a factory, these things are important. But also there's the national obligation and the chance to show that they're willing to do their bit on the fighting front.
This is really true. And it's really something that we've emphasized, I think, in previous episodes, that no matter what fighting nation you're in, because there's so much mass mobilization in the First World War, either you or someone you know will have a direct connection to the fighting front, almost certainly. Somebody that you know and love is in the armed forces, or somebody that you know has somebody they know and love in the armed forces. And so it means that you are not just doing this as an abstract job. You may think every shell that you make might help to save your husband's life or your son's life. The more weapons you can put in his hands, the more likely he is to come home safely. And that's an incredibly powerful motivator across the fighting fronts, but especially in Britain and the British Empire. That it's not abstract. The war isn't distant because you have loved ones in it. And your work is contributing, in fact, to this. And in fact, it's significant that there's just a huge exiting of women workers from domestic service in the First World War. It becomes something of a standing joke, in fact, that there's not a maid to be found apart from the very elderly for the wealthy who want a domestic servant. And one of the things that is written about with this, you can see this being discussed during the war, is why have all these young women left domestic service? And people sometimes try and tempt domestic workers back by offering very good pay to come back and be a maid or a nursemaid or so on. Nobody does. It doesn't work. And one of the reasons that's identified in the war is women, as well as being well paid in the factories and it being different, it being a bit more exciting perhaps, it's also because they feel they're directly contributing to the war and possibly even directly contributing to their loved one's survival. And that's a really, really powerful motivator if you have that going. And crucially, too, I'd add another element, and that's that in Britain, America, Canada, and Australia, and New Zealand, it's different in France and Germany. But in these countries, women working leads actually to noticeable improvements. Real wages rise in Britain, almost uniquely in Europe. Life is actually, sounds strange, but on the home front, life improves. Standards of eating improve. Infant mortality declines. People have more disposable income, which generally they spend on better quality food, which in turn improves their health and creates a sort of virtuous cycle. And so why would you sort of give this up? Why would you go back to domestic service, even if you're being offered quite a lot of money, when you can earn good money in the factories? It's different, it's exciting, and you feel you're contributing to the victory, which you've got a personal stake in. And that, I think, speaks to something about the home front, which we touched on last episode, that one of the reasons I think the war goes on for as long as it does, it takes so long for the combatant nations to be ground down, is there is so much support at home. People are committed to this war and committed to prosecuting this war very intensely, and that includes the women in the war factories.
It does. And I think one of the things that we should maybe just establish at this point as well, and you've talked very well there on the idea of just how important it is for those individuals to be creating those shells and how it might save the loved one's life. I think what we need to remember is that there's a very real backdrop to all of this that's going on from 1914 right through to 1918. And that's, of course, this tragic lottery that is the loss of life on the Western Front, because, of course, it's not always the case that a loved one is going to come home safe. But it is always the case that shells need to be made. It is always the case that the trains need to run. It is always the case that the land needs to be worked. And in many situations, those kind of things need to continue even when individuals have suffered personal loss. And this is something that's, I think, one of the most emotive and powerful aspects of the life of women in the Great War. They're only ever a postman away from finding out that their world has been turned upside down, possibly more than once in a 4-year period, with someone very, very close to them losing their lives. But they continue to work. and that motivation stays, and those people continue to do what they can. You can just imagine what a lunch canteen may have been like on a day or a week, perhaps up in the northwest of the UK, following something like the first day of the Somme, when God knows how many people in a factory, young girls will be getting letters home that dad, brother, loved one, sweetheart is not coming home. It's a really powerful image for me, at least, to think that, these people have to put up with this all of the time. And at any point, the situation can change, yet they still carry on.
It's a great point, and one that I think you do well to remember now, that this is, we've said people are producing because they want to help the war effort, but the cost of that is that the war effort takes a toll. And that picture you've just painted of the canteen when in the aftermath of severe fighting with the Somme, Passchendaele, other battles, or there's accounts, in fact, of women usually will queue outside the factory before before the shift begins, and some of them will have known from previous days that there's been a huge battle, there's casualties, they're waiting for that. And the tension is enormous, and it affects women's work. There's no doubt about it. How could it not? One thing that does come out of this is that working in all women or predominantly women factories, as strange as it sounds, it does provide a sort of emotional protection, because so many of the women you're working with are in the same situation as you. They're worrying about their loved ones. They may have lost loved ones in the past, or they may have lost in the most recent battle. And so it gives you at least a basis in which you can grieve. Grief at work is actually something there's been a little bit of academic work done on. And of course, it's a difficult and emotive issue. Officially, you cannot take bereavement leave except to bury a loved one. And that's something that isn't going to happen if your husband or your son has died in France. You're not going to go and attend his funeral in the First World War. And there's a debate, in fact, about should women who've lost loved ones in battle be allowed time off work. And it's never really fully satisfied. It's largely left down to the decision of the individual factory owner. What we can see is that women do inevitably take time off to grieve. But in many cases, this being the era it was, you might take a day to grieve, draw the curtains in the house, which is a traditional marker you've lost a loved one, and then you're back at work the next day. And one of the reasons for that is that there is a shared community here, that so many of the women are going through the same that you are, or they may have already experienced it. And it actually leads to very strong bonds being formed between the women. But I think that's absolutely necessary, Dan, because otherwise the psychological pressure at a time when there's a major battle raging, you take the Battle of the Somme, beginning in the infantry assault beginning in July 16, not ending until November 1916, heavy casualties each month, news coming in all the time. It must have been a tremendous psychological burden for everybody involved.
Yeah, almost unimaginable. But, when we think of this, and I think you hit the nail on the head there where you mentioned the word community, because, we have various different levels of community that kind of that come to the fore during this time period. You've got your own department, you've got your own factory, you've got your local county and the regiments that are away fighting. Then, of course, you've got the national community at the same time. And these things overlap. And it's really interesting how this sense of community is so strong, and these bonds so important during the Great War, not only in the negative, as we've been talking about there, where you get these horrific moments, but also there are positive impacts. And there are some unusual, perhaps less known situations that come to the fore, including things like women getting really engaged in sports. And, it's a great one to mention. Now we finally got a half decent English football team. It's certainly not the men's one, it's the women's one. And of course, women's football is a really big deal in the First World War, Spence.
It is. And a lot of women's sporting activities, which have been bubbling under the surface prior to 1914, a lot of these sporting activities come from the fact that women are engaged in what were typically male workplaces. And British sport in the 19th century, at least popular working class British sport, owes almost everything to workplace associations. It's workplace teams that drive forward the initial popularity of sport. Whereas the upper classes tend to play sport at private school and at university, the working class play sport as a result of their workplace teams. And when you've got lots and lots, hundreds of thousands, millions overall of women involved in this, they need some recreation too. They need some leisure time. they need things. And it's not a huge jump from thinking about, well, there's these football pitches here. There are these cricket pitches here. Why don't we form women's teams and women's associations to actually carry these games out? And that's absolutely outrageous at the time. It's not completely unknown, I would stress, but on the scale that it ultimately takes place in, it becomes massive. And what's really interesting, I think, Dan, is that sport, of course, in Britain and in much of the wider empire has been paused for the duration of the war. It's felt it's not really appropriate for having huge crowds going and watching sporting games when there's millions out fighting. Plus, on top of that, many sportsmen have actually gone to war. But there's definitely a hunger for sport. There's still millions of men on the home front, either engaged in war work or perhaps wounded soldiers, or men who just simply can't serve because of illnesses or disability. And they're hungry for sport. And into that gap actually comes women's sport during the course of the First World War.
Yeah, it does. And in a big way as well, surprisingly big way. In fact, I would argue, and I think there's probably some evidence to back this up, that actually the most highly attended women's games in history up until probably this year or the year before have actually occurred in the First World War. Quite simply, you get tens of thousands of people go to watch the very top women's teams. Predominantly, it should be said, from factory teams. So the most famous of them is Dick Kerr's ladies team. They are basically an unstoppable juggernaut of female football. They play something like, in their history, 870 odd games, and they win all but about 50 of them. It's incredible. The standard of play and the quality is really out of this world. So, but the amazing thing is, during the war, they're going to draw crowds of 10,000 plus on a regular basis. This is mind-blowing, in the same way that it's also understandable. And I think the whole idea of this, women all of a sudden being put into this position of true importance in work, dedicated war work, to them, when they do have an opportunity to express themselves and have some recreation, to throw themselves into that as well. We see it with men on the fighting front. Very hard life in the trenches, fight as hard and as much as they can. And when they're back in the R&R areas, they certainly make the most of that experience as well. It's exactly what we see mirrored on the home front. So no great surprise in some senses, Spence, but an important distinction to make, that women are not always 100% all of the time just filling shells. Of course, that would never be the case. It's just not realistic.
No, it's not. And the idea about how you're going to enjoy the workplace, we've painted a picture, of course, of the sacrifices that are being made, but there is a thriving working class culture across all the Western nations. It's often thought by the upper classes that the working class don't have any culture. They tend to look down on them. They don't know what they're doing. In fact, there's a thriving and complex culture that's going on there. Music hall, of course, is absolutely huge. Music hall shows are massive. And of course, you start to get music halls actually shift their programs to cater for the fact that there's lots more women coming to actually see the shows than perhaps there would have been in the pre-war period. Fewer men, more women. And so the music hall programs of 1917 and 18 tend to emphasize a lot more entertainments that are thought to appeal to a female audience. Now, whether they do or not, we have to guess that in the absence of opinion polls. But what we can say is that music hall performances are absolutely enormous in 1917 and 1918, as is, as you've said, ladies football. Dick Kerr, which is of course a factory name, they're based around in the north of England. They're based around Preston, the home of association football, in fact. And as you say, they draw huge crowds. They actually play a Christmas Day game in 1917. And Christmas 1917 is a pretty bleak time for the British war effort. At Preston North End's ground, they play Arundel Factory and they beat them 4-0. And 10,000 people attend to watch that game. You've got almost record attendances in London and indeed other cities' theatres in the winter of 17 and 18. You've got large-scale attendances in cinemas as well. Cinema is, of course, an important factor in the First World War. Episode of its own deserved, I think. And what's noted is it's mainly women who actually go to the cinema, and often unaccompanied or in groups. Factories even organise days out to the cinema so you can watch things. And that shapes things. That the fact that this working group of women now need their own entertainments changes things a little bit. They don't necessarily want quite the same thing that the men who were dominating these industries wanted before. But whatever they do get involved with, it's fascinating to see that it quickly becomes the standard approach. Ladies football being an absolutely classic example, I think. So it's really interesting that it shapes the culture of the First World War. And in fact, British soldiers coming back into Britain in late 17, early 18, one thing that quite a number of them remark on, either at the time or in their post-war memoirs, is that the balance of power in particularly the biggest cities feels like it's changed. There's lots and lots of women walking around. They've obviously got some money. They're fashionable, but they're participating in their own activities. They don't necessarily need a man to walk them to the theatre or back. And it's a little bit strange. There's a sort of sense that the world's changing. I mean, if you've been out on the Western Front as a soldier for several years, perhaps you haven't had that much leave back at home, and suddenly you come back in the winter of 1718, Britain's going to look a little bit different to you at that time. It's going to be a little bit striking. And this is, of course, going on all the time. This process is an evolutionary process across Britain and, of course, the wider English-speaking world.
Yeah, I think you could argue there's a confidence to women that there wasn't in the early part of the war, and you can make that a general and then a very specific comment in certain instances as well. It's if you take the idea of women's suffrage in particular, that we've not really touched on in this episode, which of course is really, up until about the point in the First World War, is really on a high, and there's a real big push for women getting the vote. In many cases, that gets paused in 1914, which is unusual and perhaps a story for another day. Partially in favour of people just saying, well, now we've got a job to do. We've got to win the war first and we'll figure it out afterwards. There's also a desire on some parts to say, well, okay, well, let's prove that we deserve the vote. And so that there are a number of different things that we can talk about when it comes to women's suffrage. But what my feeling, at least, is that 4-year period really represents a much larger period of what you would call a natural evolution towards women getting the vote and parity and equal pay. Actually, that time period really condenses down probably 10, 15 years of kind of natural evolution into just that 4-year period. So as you say, Spencer, a lot of people coming home, there's really quite a large shock for, just how big and how much things have changed. But there's something that I think we're apt to forget here, and it's an important point, particularly when we talk about, these large rise in women in the workforce, especially when men aren't available, because some of the traditional roles, they've still got to be fulfilled. We're talking about people going into the factory and working incredibly, munitionettes, working very long hours, very difficult conditions. Well, what if you've got a couple of young kids at home? That's a really tough gig then.
This is really true. And this is something that just has not been a factor in society before this time, because it's generally felt that once a woman has children, if she can't look after the child in some way, shape or form, well, it's certainly not the government's duty to do that for her. And in some ways, that pressure hasn't really been exerted because the working class tends to live in larger family groups. In some cases, you might well live grandparents, parents and children, so that in a single house, which is awfully tight squeeze, but it means there's always somebody to watch the children. But with men away at work, away in the front, women at work, it does become a factor. And it's something that's not completely, but largely unheard of prior to the outbreak of the First World War. And so you start getting daycare, as we call it now, or nurseries. And these are initially actually tied specifically to workplaces where you need the women to work. Well, they've got children. They don't have any grandparents they can call upon. Husbands away at war. Sons are away at war in factories. So you need somewhere to keep them. And it's interesting that the extent to which that's considered a shock in British society, that, oh my God, we've actually got to do something about this. But if you don't do something about that, the women quite rightly say, well, I can't leave my 3-year-old on his own at home. I've got to look after him. That means I can't work for you. And that can create some tensions, especially if you've got a woman who's experienced. You want your skilled and experienced munitionettes. So these are things that were so rare to consider before the war and then become standard. We can perhaps push it too far. The idea that every woman's going to have a childcare place is just not the case. It's going to be a case-by-case basis. It's going to be almost entirely based around armaments factories rather than other roles. But it's still a sort of remarkable change. And it really is controversial at the time because people are concerned about this, are concerned about this isn't right, children need their mothers and so on. But the demands of the war, the demands that children may need their mothers, but the nation needs ammunition is ultimately the nation wins out in this debate as far as the government's concerned.
That's a great slogan. I wonder if they didn't use it, they probably should have done in the Great War. Yeah, absolutely. Entirely correct. And it's fascinating, if you walk around the UK or anywhere today, I'm sure if you ask people about the kind of, if you like, the etymology of daycare and nursery, not many people would tie it to, at least its popularity, to the First World War. So one of those things that we still see today. Now, of course, Spence, we've got to talk nursing for at least a little while towards the end of this podcast, because it's such an important thing. And interestingly, a big part of what we've been covering so far in this episode has been really angled towards the working class. The working class girls and ladies, they're going to go into munitions factories, they're going to work very hard, they're going to do a dangerous job for long periods of times in many cases. Not necessarily the case for the middle and upper class women, who I think are less likely to go into munitionette work. What you might find them doing, though, is going into nursing. And it could involve going all the way to the Western Front, which has got its own excitement and dangers, but it could also be working in something like a convalescent home. And these are really important. I think one of the things that I know we've touched on in previous episodes, but that certainly deserves repeating now is, women working in nursing really do see the worst of war. They see the results of these horrific battles on the Western Front. They see people coming back with awful wounds or even losing their lives weeks or months later. It's a shock for many people. But also, we touched on this before, the idea of a friendly female face for those guys coming home, actually, in many cases, a really big thing.
This is a great subject. I think it deserves an entire episode on itself, both women in nursing and also women in uniform and auxiliary services, which we perhaps can cover in a future episode. But nursing's a really interesting one because you're absolutely right that when the war breaks out and middle class and upper class women want to be involved in it, the obvious route for them to go is into nursing. It's seen as a respectable trade for an upper class woman. It's seen as something to be admired. The image of the female nurse prior to the First World War is very romanticized, anchored in the legend of Florence Nightingale and the Crimean War. And so thousands of women will actually join in various forms nursing organizations. And of course, there's pre-existing military nursing organizations. There's the Voluntary Aid Detachment, the VAD, and the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, which are both actually formed pre-1914. And in fact, by 1914, there's thousands of these female aid detachments actually registered with the government to be activated in the event of war. And then on top of that, you have enormous numbers of women pouring in. And the biggest organisation is the VAD, which by the end of the war is going to boast somewhere in the region of about 90,000 British and Irish women. And on top of that, you've also got nursing detachments from Australia, New Zealand, Canada. You have the American nursing detachments who are also traveling to this. But you made a point about the exposure to the hardships of treating wounded men, and the horrors of that is absolutely shocking, especially if you're from a middle class background and you might not have seen violence and injury up close in the same way you might have done if you're a working class. And a quote that I think really captures this. This is from a Mrs. D.M. Richards, who was working as a VAD in Britain, and she wrote about her first experience of changing a difficult dressing on a wounded soldier. And I'm going to read it out, and listeners, if you're eating something, I suggest you put it down. But she wrote this: "Hold that stump," said the sister, and the poor chap must have felt like hell because I gripped his leg well above the knee, but the pus was still pouring over my hands. In a very few seconds, I was carted to the fire escape, and the last I remember is that somebody said, "Put your head between your knees and you'll be all right." And that's the reality, in fact, of working with these wounded soldiers who've reached the base hospitals and need treatment. Terribly injured men, sometimes with infections or illnesses or ghastly wounds that you then have to treat. And in fact, when you have a major battle and thousands of casualties are pouring in and you're trying to deal with them as fast as you can, the conditions are almost unimaginable. In fact, it's so draining and so traumatic for nurses that there are actually convalescent camps for nurses that are set up to give the nurses some time to actually recover from the brutality of dealing with these terribly injured men. And I'd love to do a full episode on nursing in the First World War. Great topic of itself. But that is a crucial role. And we talked about the treatment to the wounded in an earlier episode. But without those tens of thousands of nurses from around the British Empire, it's not possible that the medical services on the Western Front could have been sustained. So this is a really crucial role and a really harrowing one too.
Yeah, I was just thinking of a lady by the name of Edie Appleton as you were describing the situation. She's actually a pre-war nurse. She's about 40 by the time war breaks out. She spends her time at a casualty clearing station, which we've covered in our medical evacuation episode. And I remember her very vividly in her diary. She describes the influx of individuals coming back. First a small stream and then later a torrent as a result of the Battle of the Somme. Many of these men are going to go back and then find convalescence at home. But just to kind of punctuate the idea of putting up with the worst of war, I remember she particularly takes takes ownership to a certain extent of this young 19-year-old boy who's come into her care, and she really looks to try and ease his suffering, because she says that he's had both of his eyes shot through. And he comes in with his eyes smashed to pieces, and he famously says to her, and she remarks this in her diary, so no doubt it really impacted her. She said, "Will I be all right, nurse? I can't see a thing." And she just simply writes, "Poor boy, he never will." And that's very, very powerful. It sticks with me today, thinking about that and the experiences she had. The same thing tragically applies for those that are on the home front. Because, of course, wounds, and particularly bad wounds, facial wounds, disfiguring wounds, they're going to be potentially lethal months or even years later. And, to be a convalescent, be working in a convalescent home, for example, looking after gassed or badly wounded individuals, must have been utterly harrowing, particularly if you add that backdrop that, these horrifically wounded guys that you're seeing come home are coming from exactly the same place that your brother or your dad or your husband or your son is in. It's just, it's remarkable. The fortitude of nurses, I think, is just incredible.
It is. And let's not forget, too, that as well as the actual psychological pressure of treating these terribly wounded men, perhaps with the knowledge that somebody that you love is in the same battle zone, there's also a very real risk to you. As we've discussed in the wounded episodes, the frontline or the medical treatment is sometimes within range of enemy artillery, particularly if the front is moving fast, as it is in 1918. Air raids take place behind the lines. Nurses are killed in German air raids. British nurses are caught in these. There's a very real physical threat to you. Going back to Vera Britton, who is working as a nurse in 1918, and she's works as a nurse when the spring offensive begins, and she reflects that this is the one moment in the war when she actually thinks we might lose the war. And that period actually of the German advance, where hospitals have to shift back in some cases, there's a lot of movement in that period. That's really challenging as well. There's real physical risks here. And it's a really, really tough job. And then on top of that, of course, you could be out in France for a long time. You're cut off from your own friends and family if you're not based in the UK. Spare a thought for the Australian nurses who find themselves working in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq. Not only are you far from home, but there's actually no Australian soldiers fighting in Mesopotamia. You're treating British and Indian soldiers instead. And if you're a nurse in one of those distant theatres, Salonika, the Middle East, Mesopotamia, you're a long way from civilization, and you're at risk of all the diseases that these regions are known for. It is a very, very hard and challenging job. And I think it's interesting to me that in the First World War, at the time, there's a huge emphasis on factory work, because that's where the majority of women will find themselves working if you're entering that. But there's also these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if you include Empire detachments too, who are working in the medical services too. And there's actually some tension, in fact, between women munition workers and nurses about who's got the harder job. Nurses are quite well paid comparatively, but if you're a munitions worker, and depending on the period of the war and what type of munitions you're working with, you can earn even more than that. And for some nurses, there's frustration about that, because it's seen as, well, it's not that hard. I think, or I hope in the course of this podcast, we've established it is really hard in a munitions factory too. Wherever you end up working in the First World War, it's probably going to be really hard. But it speaks, I think, to some of the tensions, but also the moral character that these women endure it, succeed at it. And it's absolutely essential, in fact, for the war effort that they do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Ordinary people living in extraordinary times is something that we quite often hear, and I think it's perfectly fitting in this scenario. I just want to throw something else in there as well, which perhaps 3 or 4 years ago wouldn't have hit home as well. I wonder if it does now, though. You have to remember that 1918 also brings with it another threat, which totally upsets the entire balance of Britain, in fact, the world as we know it, because, of course, the Spanish flu comes along. And this all-encompassing war, which is already in extraordinarily difficult conditions, now gets a global pandemic thrown on top that claims something like 50 million lives around the world. Now, I don't know. I think we can all probably imagine much better than what we could have done a couple of years ago, just how difficult that scenario would have been. But in terms of the fortitude and the will to carry on and just simply the lottery of life for those guys that are working in these dangerous environments or have loved ones that are operating in dangerous environments, it must have been an unforgettable time for anybody to have lived through that period. And, that's the thing, Spence, when it comes to anything that we discuss with the Great War. It's so difficult, I think, today to look through it with the 21st century lens and really understand what it would have been like. And perhaps less understood than any of those environments is really just the daily life of women in the Great War. Because, we scraped the surface today, I think, but there's so much more. We haven't really looked at the social fabric and what it was actually like to just go about your daily life during that time period. But it's certainly something that we certainly shouldn't forget.
Absolutely not. I mean, we really have. It has been a tour of the horizon, and we've focused overwhelmingly on Britain and the British Empire. The experience of women in Germany and France is quite different, for example. The experience of women in America is rather different too. Experience of women in Australia is a little bit different as well. There's slightly different pressures in Australia because there's never conscription. There's so much we could do. We could do, as I said, I think at the start of this episode, a set within a set within a set about this. And the daily life on the home front, just what happens day to day, what does life look like is something that we're apt to forget. And in actual fact, we still have quite a narrow vision of that, particularly with the working class, because so much of what was originally studied about women in the war came from upper class writers. They had access to publishing. They were highly literate. They wrote very affecting prose or even poetry about this. Whereas the average working class woman, although would be literate, had no access to publishing. And unless there happened to be, she was a diarist and she kept this, much of what they may have thought, their inner lives, as we call it, are largely lost. And we have to piece them together in other ways. But I think what we can say is that and this is true of women, I think, across all the combatant nations, they showed a great deal of courage and fortitude, and indeed they had to. And as we sort of round this up, it's worth reflecting about tragedy isn't quite the right word, but something that seems rather bitter as we come to the end of this episode and we've reflected on the sacrifices, the effort that's put in by women, is that once the war ends and the armies are demobilized, especially the British army is demobilized, there's a real effort that is pretty successful in large respects of putting the genie back into the bottle and saying, okay, ladies, you've done very well for 4 years. The men are back now. They need their jobs back. You're all going to have to go back to doing what you did previously. And there is certainly some serious social opposition to that, Dan.
Yes, but of course, when men do come back, there is this desire, and in some cases, a contracted right of men who have left their jobs in 1914 to have their jobs back. This is a really bitter pill to swallow, Spence.
It is, and a future episode is demobilization, because actually there's a lot of tension in Britain during the demobilization period. Men are coming back from war. The Spanish flu, of course, has the world in its grip. They're coming back to a world that if you've been out for 4 years, it's almost a world you don't know. You've been away for 4 years. Britain looks very different. And there's very little social safety net in Britain. People are keen to get their jobs back. In some cases, they want their jobs back. But in most cases, they need their jobs back. And the idea that, well, sorry, your daughter is now doing your job. to the man of 1918, that's not good. There's real social tension. There's a lot of unrest around the demobilization period. Men are unhappy. They want to be demobilized. They want their jobs back. There's a lot of government concern about all this. And the quick and easy answer is, well, the women are just going to have to go back to whatever they were doing before the war. And that creates a sort of social crunch as well, which is the subject for an entirely different episode, I think. And of course, in 1918 in Britain, universal male suffrage is introduced, all men over 21. And women also get the vote, but only over the age of 30. And one of the reasons for that is women below the age of 30 are too flighty. Their minds haven't fully developed. They don't know what they're doing. And so they need to be a bit older and wiser before they're allowed to vote. I mean, looking at it now through the eyes of the 21st century, we can laugh at that. But at the time, that's how it's felt. And that causes a lot of tension and frustration as well. It does get revised later in the 1920s, but only belatedly. But I think that they're really important, although largely all these jobs that women have been doing, of course, some don't exist anymore. You don't need mass munitions after the war. You don't need tens of thousands of nurses after the war. Those jobs are going to evaporate and men are going to go back to the railways, the policing and so on and so forth. But of course, what can't be changed, though you can revise the labour forces, you can't take away the memory of what's happened. And although modern day historians tend to say, well, there wasn't really any lasting change after the First World War, everybody just went back to how it largely was before the war. I think psychologically there was a change. I think there was a huge change. And I think we actually see the results of that change, perhaps most visibly in the Second World War 20 years later, where suddenly women in the workforce are not a novelty, they're an expectation. But that's a topic for perhaps an entirely different podcast, Dan.
Yeah, it's so difficult to put a particular I or cross the T on this one, because just as you were talking, I was thinking, we could go into things like divorce rates and the tragic story of things like domestic violence at home when you've got these damaged characters coming up against these now confident women who have done their own bit, and how that clash happens in the home. There's so many things that we could cover, but we do need to come to an end, and this is our point for today. As always, thank you ever so much. No doubt we'll revisit this episode in due course. We're going to continue exploring the fascinating story of the Great War on the Western Front. As always, thanks once again for coming along to join us, and we'll see you again next time. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
The most obvious is, of course...
Oh, sorry, go back. I just overspoke you. Yeah, go.
No, I'll cut to you actually, Dan, because I've spoken for a while. So